Alisa Cohn, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to chat with you today. We're going to be exploring the shift from startup to scaling and the biggest challenges that startup founders face as they shift into that new CEO role in the scaling phase. That's a really hard transition for a lot of people. Frankly, most don't really do it well. They don't really know how to do it. So we're going to talk about all the ins and outs of that as we have our conversation today. As we get started, I wanted to share Alisa's bio with everybody. Named the top startup coach in the world at the Thinkers 50 Marshall Goldsmith Global Coaches Awards in London, Alisa Cohn has been coaching startup founders to grow into world-class CEOs for nearly 20 years. She is the author of From Startup to Grown Up, published by Cohn Page, a one-time startup CFO, strategy consultant, and current angel investor and advisor. She was named the #1 global guru of startups in 2021 and has worked with startup companies such as Venmo, Etsy, DraftKings, The Wirecutter, Mack Weldon, and Tory Burch. She has also coached CEOs and C-suite executives at enterprise clients such as Dell, Hitachi, Sony, IBM, Google, Microsoft, Bloomberg, the New York Times, and Calvin Klein. And really, I could go on and on and on because you have such an amazing, illustrious career. But I want to give the floor over to you. Anything else you would like to share and highlight for listeners before we launch on into the conversation?
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, just to say that I became a coach to make a difference. And it's really the most important part of my work is that I can touch people's lives and really make a difference for them in a professional context. So it's really powerful to be able to work with founders. It's really an honor to work with entrepreneurs and founders who are changing the world, to be able to work with them and be part of their leadership journey.
Yeah, well said. Well, very good. And being in this coaching space and working with founders and entrepreneurs, but also those who are working to scale, why don't you lay out really the crux of your book, From Startup to Grown Up, because that gets at a lot of what we're going to be discussing today. And then we can start to dive in further.
I would love to. So my book, called From Startup to Grown Up, is it's about the journey of founder to CEO. So it's divided into 3 sections: managing you, managing them, and managing the business. And then in the appendix are a number of scripts to help you with delicate conversations or difficult conversations. So if you think about the journey of any leader, really, it starts with you. So the first person you lead every day is the one who wakes up in your pajamas. And the point is that you need to think about your triggers, about the things that maybe set you off, the things that you are naturally inclined to, that you would maybe move towards or move away from. And having that self-awareness is super helpful to set you on the right path to be the right leader for the company, kind of wherever you are. The second part about managing you has to do with managing your psychology. Lots of ups and downs in our lives, lots of ups and downs in leadership. That goes double for founders, triple for founders. So really thinking about how do you make sure that you're kind of in the right emotional state all the time and are not susceptible to severe self-doubt or, kind of perseverating. So that's managing you. Managing them is around who do you need to be as a leader in order to get people to follow you. It's also about the tactics, delegation, running great meetings, creating psychological safety, how do you give feedback, and all the tools that you need to be a great manager and leader for your people in service of managing the business, which has to do with making sure that you're putting together dashboards and making sure that you set goals and everybody knows where they're going. It's surprising to me how regularly founders don't naturally think about how to measure their impact. They're happy if it's going up and to the right. And my point of view is like, well, how do you know it shouldn't be a little more up and a little more to the right? And then, and I also would just say I have 2 chapters in that section around managing your co-founder and also managing your board. Everybody has difficult and delicate relationships around them that they have to think about managing. And certainly for founders, it has to do with their board and their co-founder. And the last part, as I said, is 14 scripts to help you manage or get your mouth around the words of delicate conversations, difficult conversations, like giving difficult feedback, like announcing layoffs, like even just having career chats with people, and then ultimately sometimes firing people, which does sometimes happen.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. Thanks for the background on your book. And you lay out a whole bunch of really important elements that are going to be important as we lean into our own leadership. And I like the typology of breaking it down into those 3 categories. That's also very helpful. So with all of those things that you just said, there's lots of things we need to try to learn how to do and to do well. But what would you say is the biggest challenge facing those startup founders as they start to make that shift, as they start to mature as an organization, as they start to grow and scale?
Well, I mean, there's so many challenges, but one that comes to mind that's very big is recognizing that you have to let go of the last identity in order to, assume the mantle of the next identity. So one of my clients that I work with, the CEO would do it all hands, super casual, and just, kind of be joking around and even just like make a little bit like sarcastic comments or whatnot. And then after they got north of like 150 people, somebody finally said to him, hey, it's not acceptable anymore for you just to like, just kind of wing it. You're now the leader of a really like a real organization. You need to start acting like it. And it's hard for them to sort of see that. The other thing is that there are old timers, people who started with you when you were just 8 people in a room, who don't want you to grow. They like the old casual you. They think, you're getting all formal and hierarchical and bureaucratic. And that can be also have a chilling effect on founders to kind of grow into who they need to be.
Yeah. So that psychological shift, that's a really interesting thing to hone in on, because I've also seen that, you have founding teams that usually form because you have this great idea, or you have this great product service, this great code, this great app, whatever, and you have people with all this technical expertise that plays in it, an important part in the team, and so you have the founders that play that initial role of expertise, and it can be really, really hard to move into a different role psychologically, generally speaking. But also, adding on to what you just said, I think just the shift from being the expert driving the product or service to being the leader of experts driving the innovation and the products and services, that's a big, big shift. And that's something that is very difficult. Frankly, most people aren't able to do it. And so the organization starts to flounder because they have a hard time letting go of control over the areas of expertise and leaning on their people and empowering them. And they just failed to make that shift into really what a CEO should be in terms of strategy, big picture, all of those sorts of things.
It's so true. It's hard for any leader to do that. I mean, if any leader, as they grow, they have to, sort of let go of their own satisfaction in their own results and take on the satisfaction of other people's results. That's really hard to do. Let's be honest. So it's especially hard to do for a founder, because it's like, hey, this is like my baby. I interviewed a number of founders for my book, and I talked to Dennis Crowley, who's the CEO or the former CEO, but the founder of Foursquare, and also a former client of mine. And he talked about his experience learning to delegate, and it was very challenging for him. Like, first you delegate the stuff that you don't really even like, the business processy stuff, or maybe sales or whatever. And then over time, more and more, you're delegating the stuff that actually you feel primarily a part of. It's kind of why you built the business, but you'll never be able to get where you need to go if you hold on to it the entire time.
Yeah. And a lot of that comes back to the culture that you want to build within your organization. So again, when it's just the founding team and you have a handful of people in a room together, that's one thing. And don't get me wrong, a culture will emerge. Anytime you get 2 or more people together, a culture will emerge within that group. Mm-hmm. But it's one thing when you're all just kind of together and you're working closely together, and then over time you start to grow the team and you start to have people reporting to you. And now all of a sudden you're not all in the same room. And many founders just simply don't have the people management capabilities or the leadership competencies to understand, as things grow, how to look at things in terms of organizational design, work design, organizational culture, and how to drive the type of culture that they want in a proactive way, so that you're not just allowing whatever to emerge, but you're actually very thoughtful about strategically, what culture do we want? How are we going to get there? And there are ways to develop and then sustain the type of culture you want. And again, that's one of those big gaps that I think a lot of founders have, as they're trying to transition into a more of a traditional CEO role. So let's talk a little bit more about the culture piece. How can leaders making that transition start to, tackle that really difficult piece? Because don't get me wrong, I mean, most organizations struggle with culture. Even some of the best organizations, the ones we hold up all the time as being the epitome and the example of really great, safe, healthy cultures, dynamic, innovative cultures, they still have issues too. Like everyone does. It's a hard thing.
Right.
But when you have people who don't have any real background or skill set in that, and now
Yeah.
they're expected to lead this growing nascent organization and develop a culture that's going to be sustainable and positive, how do they go about doing that?
Well, the first is, to your point, make it important. So I think there's a lot of founders who, until I show up as the coach, don't always know, like, oh, actually, this is something that's really, really important for you and significant for the growth of your company. So really understanding that and making peace with that at first, and then really thinking about what is the kind of company that, number one, I and my co-founders want to be a part of and want to build and lead. And then also, what's going to help us get where we're going? So one founder I worked with, he told me he's very smart. He's doing this very deep technology stuff. And he told me, the smartest people he could find, Stanford PhDs, everything. I'm like, that's fantastic. And then like a month later, he said to me, they're not working together. I can't get them to work together. I said, right, well, did you hire them for collaboration or did you just hire them for smart? He's like, yeah, I guess I just hired them for smart. So it's like I have the best rowing team in the world, but the boat is going around in circles because I can't get them, to sort of collaborate together. So we realized that he had to really identify and codify and insist on collaboration, and then hire around collaboration and reward around collaboration. And sadly, fire people who were not collaborative, because that was even more important than smart.
Well, yeah. And, I've said this before on the podcast. I say it, sometimes to, family, friends, or whatever. But, I know I'm in academia. I know a lot of really smart people in terms of IQ, in terms of education and knowledge and skill set. I know a lot of people that are really traditionally smart, in that way.
Right.
I also know a lot of people who are probably among the most brilliant people I know, who are also among the dumbest people I know, because they have the IQ, they don't have the EQ, they don't know how to work together, and so they can think big thoughts all day long, but they can't accomplish, they can't produce,
Right.
and that's a problem, right? And especially in a startup phase, you have to be producing constantly, you have to be innovating constantly, and getting brilliant people in the room, that's awesome, that's really important. But if they can't work together, then it's wasted talent, it's wasted resources, and ultimately you're not going to get to where you want to be.
Yeah, it's so true. It's very true.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit more now, as we get into the second half of our conversation, around these scripts that you lay out in your book. You have all these different sample scripts for difficult moments. And I'm sure listeners have heard about difficult conversations, crucial conversations, some of these other types of books and workshops and trainings that have been out there for a long time. What is it about your sample scripts that you find to be particularly helpful for this group of individuals transitioning from startup phase into CEO roles?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reason I did it, I was writing my book and I had my structure and I was like, typing away. And I just was remembering how this is a normal thing that happens. I'll be on a Zoom call or in a meeting, in an in-person meeting with a CEO. And we'll finally get to the point where he'll realize, okay, I'm ready to have that conversation with that person. And it may not even, it might be delicate. It might be, you're a great employee and I'm bringing in a leader on top of you and it's going to be a good experience for you, but I think it's going to feel difficult for you, right? Like that's not even like a bad conversation, but it's delicate. You got to handle it. So we finally get to the point where he's on point to say it. And he's like, oh, I don't know what to say. And then I'll say, well, why don't you just say, and then I'll tell him what I think he should just say. And I see him scribbling furiously, like we're on video. I'm like, well, you can record this. He's scribbling. Say that again. So after that happens over and over again, you kind of get the sense that actually that's kind of valuable, that people find my, recitations of how I would say it valuable. And really in that moment, sitting there writing my book, I took just like a little detour and I just wrote up all the scripts off the top of my head that have been really helpful to founders. And what came from that was these scripts for delicate conversations, because you can know all you want, that you can know all day long that you need to have this conversation. But how do I say it? How do I actually say it? The words can be very elusive. So having a grounding and a template to get you started is sometimes the difference between doing it and not doing it.
All right. And people with even the best intentions often, probably usually, can be very clumsy when they're
Yeah,
trying to say something in a high stress kind of environment or a delicate
definitely.
environment where they're
Yeah,
nervous about what they're going to say, how they're going to say it. Are they, how is it going to be received? And that heightened level of anxiety and stress just increases the probability that you're going to put your foot in your mouth or say something that's not terribly effective, regardless of how good your intentions might be, or however you might even practice and want to do it. But unless you really put in the time to think through what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, why, and actually rehearse it, practice it
yeah,
over time, you're probably not going to get it right the
yeah,
first time. And so
yeah.
while I'm not, suggesting that we need to like memorize scripts, that would feel inauthentic and that would feel formulaic and robotic, and that wouldn't come off well with people. But we do need to really take the time to rehearse and think through things. And then over time in our role as leaders, we're naturally, organically just going to have more and more opportunities for those types of conversations. And
Totally.
so we will get the practice, we
Right.
will learn, we will grow into it, and we'll increase our ability to deal with those kinds of situations so
Yes.
that we're not feeling the physiological, anxiety and stress around dealing with those kinds of situations, so that we can be a little bit more clear-headed and say what we want to say in a positive way.
So true. And to your point about memorizing, I really agree. But practice, preparation is the most important of anything. And you have a high stakes leadership event, whether it's, you making a presentation, whether it's a specific kind of meeting, whether it's a delicate or difficult conversation, anything that's important, it's worth practicing in advance, role playing in advance, preparing, because that's going to help you get the most out of that moment.
And I should say, it's also fine to have notes, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's always something that's interesting to me, is people feel like there's something wrong with having like a little note card on their desk in front of them, or
Right.
you have your stuff around you anyways. If you're meeting with somebody, there's no problem in just having a few bullet points of like, these are the things we want to cover,
Right.
and that's fine. So especially as you're learning and leaning into it and trying to get comfortable with these types of difficult moments and critical conversations, you use some notes, practice,
Totally.
prepare. All
Yeah.
of that will be helpful. And it comes back to what we were already talking about, and that is, what kind of culture do you want to create
Right.
within your organization? Do you want an accountability culture, mutual accountability and trust? If so, you can't avoid these conversations. It
Right.
is such a common thing that leaders, because they're uncomfortable, they're unwilling to broach these difficult subjects with their people, and then they start to come up with all these justifications for why they're not going to have the conversation.
Totally. Yeah.
They start to come up with excuses, and they start to think, well, the person should know, they should know this is a problem, they should already understand. I haven't said it explicitly, but I've implied it many times, or I said it to somebody else, so they should have picked up on it. Like, we tell ourselves these things
Totally. That's right.
all the time as excuses to get out of having these difficult conversations,
Yeah.
and not realizing that people aren't always connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Most of the time, people aren't connecting the dots unless we're being
They
really
got their own
explicit
music
with them.
right, because they got the music in their head. Actually, John, to your point, I have I once was working with a founder, and we got into the point where it was like, yes, you need to have this conversation with your COO. Okay, fine. So ready to do it. And they were on a business trip. I'll do it on a business trip. Great. 3 days in the business trip, comes back. I said, "Do you have the conversation?" He said, "Oh no, we didn't have a minute. We didn't have time." I said, "Okay, that happens." So I happened to be talking to the COO the next day or two, and I said, "By the way, the CEO was going to maybe have this conversation with you, but I guess you guys didn't really have time together when you were on your trip in Colorado." And he said, "What are you talking about? We were in the car together for like 3 hours there and 3 hours back." And I was like, "Oh, that's what you mean when you didn't have a moment." Like, it's amazing what our mind tells us when we don't want to do something.
Yeah, and we come up with excuses, and we
Right.
procrastinate, and it's human nature. I'm
It
not
is.
I'm not trying to point fingers. We're just pointing out the
Yeah.
obvious, that this is something that most people have to deal with.
Right. Which is why you
And
need support structure around you. You need to have a
exactly.
script or a template. You need to role play. A coach is very helpful. A mentor, support structure around you helps you do the things that you don't feel like doing, but ultimately are going to get you where you want to go.
Exactly. And so, yeah, we have to have the scaffolding around us that can help us um, have those conversations in a productive way. And
Right.
again, I love the title of your book, From Startup to Grown Up. It's awesome. And as we grow into these more complex organizations, we grow into these more complex CEO roles.
Right.
Those difficult conversations and moments are just one of the components, right,
Right.
that are going to be really important. Again, we've talked about culture, the importance that that plays. We've talked about some of the challenges that these leaders are going to face as they're going through those transition phases in
Right.
scaling and growth, and just shifting their mindset and their psychological approach to their jobs. All of these are part of the equation as we're trying to figure it out. The other thing I would say is sometimes you just need to know when it's time to let go and
Yeah.
perhaps not stay with the organization.
Yeah.
You will always be a founder. And so the fact that you are a founder of a really great organization, that's something you always have a claim to.
Yeah.
But you may not have the competencies or capabilities to be an effective CEO in the way that we normally think of the term. And that's okay. Like, it's not for everybody. And if that's the case, get your founding team together, develop the business, develop the product or service, feel it out, see if it's something you want to grow into. And if not, you can move on. Like, you can
Totally.
separate, you
No
can
harm,
move
no
on
foul.
and start your next endeavor.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. People need to have, again, the self-awareness to realize this isn't me. And by the way, you can learn anything you want. I really believe that. And if you're smart to be a founder, you're smart to be a CEO. I believe that. But you may not want to learn that. You may
Yeah.
not want to invest the cycles, the energy, the calories into what it takes to build yourself and to grow in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a choice. And I'm
Yeah.
a big believer in growth mindset, abundance mindset. And we can do it
Yeah.
if we can help. If we have great ideas and can get a business off the ground and being successful, we have the smarts to be able to figure it out. But
Right.
we have to invest the time, and not everyone's going to be willing to do that.
Totally.
And that's fine. So just know
Yeah.
yourself and be willing to be honest about that.
Agree.
Well, Alisa, it's been a real pleasure. I note the time. We're getting close to the end of our time together today. But before we close, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Okay, well, thanks, John. So you can definitely come to my website, which is alisacohn.com, alisacohn.com, and you can say /scripts. And then there is 5 scripts that you can download to make your work life better for delicate conversations, and 1 to make your life better. So feel free to download that, and also join my newsletter list. You can reach me through the website, connect on LinkedIn, and say hi. And I think the final word for all of us, I'm a big believer, to your point, in growth mindset, and also the work is in you. All of us have a lot of capacity to grow and to conceive of the person we want to be and the professional we want to be, and to grow into that. So I encourage everybody to do one thing today that's going to help support your own personal growth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. I appreciate all the wisdom, the insights that you've shared with me and my listeners today. As always, I hope that listeners will reach out, get connected, find out more about what Alisa and her team can do for you. I hope everyone will stay healthy and safe, that you'll find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you have a great week.